Today, I've decided I want to finish off our discussion about Hobbes, Locke, and humanism. I was trying to find the video that would sort of combine the two ideas, because the two videos we watched in the last 2 weeks gave us a nice introduction to the life and the society that Hobbes and Locke came about many of their ideas in, but it didn't say everything I wanted to, so I just decided I would say what I want to say today. And then if you disagree, we'll let you disagree, because that's what we do here. So in the past 2 weeks, we've looked at the life and the philosophy and the societies that helped form two of the most influential social philosophers of Western thought, that is Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And my goal today is to explore their ideas just a little bit further, compare and contrast them, and to try to draw what lessons I can that we can learn as modern humanists and what can help form our thought. But with most topics that I do sort of impromptu prepare and come up here and speak about, I will preface by admitting my own ignorance of this subject. I have a sort of high school cursory knowledge of these philosophies, but I'm no scholar. My background's physics, and even when I talk about physics, I don't talk about the kind of physics I know about. So do bring your own skepticism today, question what I say, and don't take my word as gospel.
Okay, I don't think we would anyway.
Thomas Hobbes lived from 1588 to 1679, and during his life, the English Civil War sort of raged and broke out in 1642, as royalists and those loyal to the monarchy, including Hobbes, were eventually chased out of England and had to hide in continental Europe. The short and tumultuous life of Republican England tainted many of the scholars' view of democracy at the time, and led for a longing for simpler times when the monarchists and the absolutists were in power. So this sort of era helped inform Hobbes' main treatise of the Leviathan, where in it he takes sort of a rational approach to the understanding of human nature and how to promote and maintain social order that was so severely lacking in England at the time. So he argued that humans are naturally driven by our passions, which leads to what he called lives that are, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. One of those most famous quotes in the English language. This view of human nature is quite pessimistic, but according to Steven Pinker's research, as I've prefaced in earlier talks, this may not be so far off from reality. In the Better Angels of Our Nature, Pinker talks about sort of pre-societal tribes and our ape cousins, and how they kill one another in surprising numbers, in extraordinary numbers. And it's not all-out warfare where one tribe attacks another. They're smart enough to realize that the tribe with the bigger numbers is going to win, so the smaller one runs away. But what happens is at night, raiding parties from one tribe will pick off the weak ones or the people isolated from the other tribe, and it'll just be murder after murder every night for years, until the emergence of the modern state. Pinker argues that this violence was more the norm of our species rather than the exception. So Hobbes' solution to this state of perpetual murder was to require individuals to accede certain rights and freedoms to a sovereign or to a government or to a state. The state would have to hold absolute power and could dole out justice as it saw necessary. And he recognized that this sovereign didn't have to be perfect. It was just people would have to accept that injustices from the government were the price of peace. So we've reduced the amount of violence, so just accept that you're going to still have some violence. Support for this idea is also found in Pinker's book, as he reviews the growth of the first societies. When the first states were brutal and unjust towards their subjects, murder rates still began to drop, as people could have an alternate means of solving their differences rather than killing each other. So people could resort to, blaming the unjust state for their petty differences rather than having to kill each other. And so we move away from the primitive concept of might makes right to, let the state decide who's right, which isn't necessarily fair. Much can also be said of Hobbes' views on religion. Many accused him of atheism at the time, but we have to remember the word atheism has evolved over the years, and at the time it was basically a derogatory epithet they threw at everyone who didn't agree with the central Christian dogma of the time. So it's not clear whether Hobbes was an atheist in the same way that a person today, like Richard Dawkins, would call himself an atheist, or whether he just disagreed on a couple doctrinal matters and was therefore a heathen. But what makes Hobbes unique was the way he developed his theory wasn't sort of a theological approach to human understanding. It was a mechanistic approach. It was a rational and methodical sort of, let's look at people and let's break them down into, picture a person as a machine and how does that machine work, and just really looking at the materialistic view rather than churning to supernatural agents. And this approach is very similar to how humanists approach the world today. The first affirmation in the Humanist Manifesto 3, Humanism and its Aspiration, reads, "Knowledge from the world is derived from observation, experimentation, and rational analysis." Well, Hobbes negatively viewed experiments of physics at the time that were starting to go off, because he viewed rationalism and just sit in a cave and think about something until you solve the problem as the best way forward. He did have that rational thought, which was more than a supernatural, God did it explanation. He brought about a process which was very unique in the understanding of human beings. So while Hobbes lacked the modern statistical tools we have of modern sociological research, his approach was underscored by a desire to understand the world scientifically and methodically. Of course, that's not to say Hobbes rejected the supernatural or was a modern humanist. In fact, his theory relied on the state consolidating not just political power, but also spiritual and religious power. Hobbes recognized early the most effective sovereign would be the one that had authority over both the church and state. He didn't believe in secularism or separating these two. He saw that if you needed a strong state to control the evil in everyone, that sort of bad nature. And so the best way to control everyone is with religion, something we probably figured out since then as well. So he argued the state needed to have absolute control over matters of religion, and any dissent, any religious or any other dissent, would threaten that peace. So Hobbes held this view after seeing the effect of competing religious ideologies during the English Civil War, as loyalties were divided by the church. He even went as far as to blame part of the Civil War on the clergy, an idea we might find some sympathy in, blaming it on the religious. But he stated that people had been seduced from the power of the state by, quote, the clergy had pretended to have a right from God to govern everyone in his parish and their assembly. So he's blaming these clergy for trying to usurp the power of the throne and sort of leading minds astray. And that led them to dissent and cause chaos and cause the war. Even if he never claimed to be an atheist, I think it can be instructive to view Hobbes as an atheist, though. Through this lens, we can view his theories as understanding the needs of people to hold religious beliefs, hence why the state needed to control and temper those views. And if we think of Hobbes as an atheist, we can see that he wouldn't have believed in an immortal soul or the need for eternal salvation. So therefore, if the state picked the wrong religion, it wouldn't really matter, since there's no eternal souls on the line. It just needed to pick one religion and get everyone to follow it. But as an atheistic philosophy, I still don't think Hobbes' view of the world is humanist. It denigrates the individual to an uncivilized brute who needs to be tamed by an enlightened tyrant. Our only hope in the system under Hobbes is that you end up with a benign dictatorship. But instead, history seems to suggest that we're more likely to end up with a Stalin, Hitler, or Mao, whether religious or atheistic, centralizing authority and just annihilating those who disagree. So Hobbes sort of gives us the atheist justification for fascism. Now, let's turn to John Locke, and maybe we can find a little bit more enlightening philosophy in there, who was nicknamed the father of classical liberalism. Locke was born in 1632 and would have been about 19 when the Leviathan was published, so he was very much influenced by the surrounding worldview of the Hobbesian ethics. And as we heard last week, Locke's years in England were as equally turbulent as Hobbes. He lived until 1704, so he would have witnessed the English Civil War, the restoration of the monarchy, Protestants protesting a Catholic king, and the establishment of England as a constitutional monarchy under the Bill of Rights, which was pretty much his fault, or his claim to fame. Locke's major contributions to social theory were his 2 treatises of civil government and a letter concerning toleration. His views can be seen as quite divergent from Hobbes. So rather than arguing for the need of an absolute sovereign, Locke laid the foundations for the right to dissent and the need to separate the church and state. So he put down the first sort of, we should have modern secularism. He watched rival nations destroy each other across Europe during the wars of religion, and which brought Locke to argue that we should seek tolerance rather than this sort of my way or the highway approach to religion. His 3 central arguments for this was that 1, humans are fallible and mortal. We therefore have no right to claim that we have knowledge of the divine. Who among us or among the broader public could actually think to know the mind of God? 2nd, even if anyone did actually have that absolute knowledge of the one true religion, you can't spread that by force. You can't just beat someone into believing the same thing as you. It just doesn't work. They'll fake it or they'll burn. Neither of those seems morally acceptable. So finally, it's just easier to promote tolerance and diversity than to coerce or force anyone into the same worldview. So his approach was that tolerance just works better. Having this forceful ideology doesn't convince anyone. It just makes them afraid of you. It doesn't mean they believe what you want. So let's just get along while we're here. So these arguments do sound familiar as they form the tenets of most modern liberal democracies and how we approach our rights and freedoms. And Locke's views were sort of the inspiration for the US Declaration of Independence. A good idea gone wrong if there ever was one. These ideas are also present in the Humanist Manifesto 3, which affirms that humanists are concerned for the well-being of all, are committed to diversity and respecting those differing yet humane views. We care about tolerating people even if they disagree with us, so long as they don't want to hurt us for that. Locke's fundamental difference with Hobbes is basically on the basis of what human's nature is. Hobbes took the pessimistic view, but Locke saw humans as characterized by reason and tolerance, which are quintessential humanist values. So the state was necessary in Locke's view to peacefully resolve conflicts rather than to enforce peace. It was a facilitator rather than a stick. The state should be using the carrot to get people to get along. But despite these proto-humanist views, Locke ironically was very much a Christian who wrote at one point the reasonableness of Christianity. He based his social theories on inspirations from the Bible and used specific Old and New Testament passages to justify freedoms and human equality. This is what leads to the U.S. Declaration of Independence containing the phrases, all men are created equal, they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. To Locke, our equality comes from God and Jesus, not from our ability to empathize or to recognize the dignity and worth of each other. Once Locke found his biblical justifications, because he basically went to the Bible first and found his answers, then he sort of came up with the post hoc rationalization and the philosophy to underpin it. And this, in some way, does seem to hollow out the theory to me a little bit. It takes some of the weight out of it. I mean, granted, the philosophies of Locke have been built up with a strong secular foundation, a strong ethical, philosophical foundation since, but it's maybe just a touch disappointing that he had to go to the Bible first rather than sort of take the Hobbesian rational approach to come up with it. Finally, on the topic of Locke, he doesn't really seem to talk about the strength of religion as a social, cohesive force or as something that can be used to control people like Hobbes did. From Locke's view, religion is a more personal matter. He was a Protestant, so he didn't like the idea of the Catholic Church telling you what to believe. He wanted to come about your own religious views, which is sort of where he gets his ideas of freedom and tolerance. But despite his promotion of tolerance, he cut the limit at atheism. In an argument heard still today, hundreds of years later, Locke would state that the widespread disbelief in God would undermine society and lead to chaos in the streets. In Locke's defense, though, his views on atheism weren't out of step with his time. This is sort of what everyone believed. So, and to suggest other, you would immediately be painted as an atheist. If you said, well, we should also tolerate disbelief, people would just assume you're an atheist and then try to burn you at the stake for it. So, not entirely his fault maybe, but he definitely chose to spoke on the issue and attacked atheists when he could. So here we're left with a challenge. Using a humanist approach based on reason, Hobbes brought a social theory that at best calls for benign dictatorships and at worst fascism, while Locke, arguing from biblical Christianity, delivered us modern humanist values including separation of church and state and the rights and freedoms of religion and dissent. In the materialist Hobbesian worldview, we have our inner demons leading us to violence and war, while in the liberal Christian view, Locke gives us the better angels of our nature of reason and tolerance. And I took both those phrases from Steven Pinker, if you could get that I like his book. But I think it's a mistake to try to dichotomize the worldview into Hobbesian or Lockean philosophies. Hobbes gives us a lot of insight into why a state is needed. People do have these sort of bad tendencies and will try to attack each other when it's the easiest way to do. And so a state does help us tame our sort of violent nature. But the power of the state can be taken too far, and Locke was also right that we should be reasonable and tolerant of one another. His critiques established the first limits on the power of the state, giving us democratically elected governments even under a monarchy. So we got constitutional monarchies where the throne couldn't overthrow any law. They had to sort of listen to the people. It gave us the idea that the government needs the right and the consent of the governed. I hope that in the coming weeks we can sort of take these two ideas and then build upon with other philosophers and thinkers of social theory throughout the course of history and sort of develop how they each influence modern humanism and how they sort of influence yourselves. So that's what I have to say about Hobbes and Locke, and obviously I glossed over a lot, but I look forward to the conversation and the discussion.